School.
Oh, hello everyone. I hope you can see the book, which is up on the screen. Is that right, Les? Can people see it? First of all, I want to thank everyone who helped me out with this research, even people from the Bristol Radical History Group. And
Ian, hang on a minute. Ian, it's not shared. We can't see it at the moment. Can we try again?
You can't see the screen?
No, we can't. You haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, hang on. How do I do this? Sorry.
No, Ian, don't worry. These things happen.
Share screen.
That's it.
Can you see anything now?
Yeah, it's just come up. If we go back to slide 1, just go backwards because you're on slide 2 at the moment.
Right.
That's it.
Is that it now?
That's it. Now it's up, Ian. It's there now. God's Beautiful Sunshine in 1921, miners' lockout in the Forest of Dean.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah. So I was saying, I just want to, first of all, want to thank people who helped me out with all this research, particularly people from the Bristol Radical History Group helped me produce the book, and the many people from the Forest of Dean helped me with the research, in particular the Dean Heritage Centre, people like Dave Tuffley. The Dean Heritage Centre helped me, provided invaluable help with oral histories and photos. And of course, I've been in contact with children and grandchildren of the miners that were involved in the lockout in 1921. In particular, the family of David Organ, because David Organ was actually fundamental to what happened. So that basically the story belongs to them. And I just want to add, there'll be an exhibition at the Dean Heritage Centre on the lockout in June. So to start the talk, British miners were locked out on the 1st of April 1921 after they refused to go to work when their wages were significantly reduced, and in some districts like the Forest of Dean, cut in half. A locked out worker is one who refuses to go to work under the conditions imposed by their employer. The 1921 lockout had its roots in World War I. The sacrifice experienced by the miners in the pits and at the front during World War I shattered existing liberal notions of civil equality, particularly when it became apparent that the colliery owners had made huge profits out of the war. As a result, the majority of the Forest Dean working class, from tradesmen to miners' wives, sided with the miners in a struggle many viewed as fundamental to the very existence of their community, which was so dependent on mining. And here we have, I can't really see, I've got to get rid of some people. So we have a quote here from one of the locked out miners in the Gloucester Citizen on the 9th of April. "We have not entered upon the struggle without counting the cost. We know all about the depleted funds of our union caused largely through unemployment, and we realise what it would mean to our families. But better die of starvation in God's beautiful sunshine than to go back to serve our labour and semi-starvation caused by a wage that is not sufficient to keep a man, to say nothing about a family and a respectable home, which the law expects us to do." The lockout was nearly 100% solid in the forest, and attempts by the government, colliery owners and the media to break the strike locally failed. And the forest miners only went back to work because the strike collapsed nationally. The lockout lasted 3 months, after which the miners returned defeated. This talk will consider the conditions in the Forest of Dean Coalfield, which characterised the lockout in 1921 in the forest, the events leading up to the lockout and their roots in World War I, the national picture, and then a look at the actual lockout in the Forest of Dean itself. The way the lockout played out in the Forest of Dean was very much a product of the particular characteristics of the Forest of Dean Coalfield. Just a bit of a look at the first Dean Coalfield itself. This is from the Samuel Commission report, which was actually commissioned in 1925, a few years later, and it came up with this list about the conditions in the forest coalfield. It argued it was there was lack of investment, the pits were antiquated, terrible geological conditions with thin seams, flooding was a major problem, which meant a huge amount of pumping of water and the cost involved in that. There's a shortage of tubs, poor roadways, insufficient mechanical handling, and excessive underground travelling by foot. And for the miners themselves, this meant poor conditions, which were wet and cramped, low productivity and low pay, high rates of death, injury, and industrial disease, and quite widespread use of teenage labour from 14 plus onwards. So this is one of the conditions were particularly worse in the house coal collieries. There are steam coal collieries in the forest as well, where the seams were thicker, but this is the sort of conditions that people were working in the forest and in the house coal collieries. You can see how, you know, some of the seams were only 18 inches in depth. These photos are actually from Lightmoor Colliery, taken in the 1930s. So this is a quote from Jesse Hodges Jr., who, if anyone from the forest they might have heard about Jesse Hodges from Cinderford. Molly Morris, he was a great big man. He used to work in 13 inches. He used to squeeze his stomach right in. You worked on his side and it was wet, water coming down all the time in that seam, and you dragged yourself in and you dragged yourself out, and men worked in that. They lay on their sides at work, hauling the coal out. There was hardly any room to use a pick, and that's how that was done. That's what I said. We were animals. We were classed as animals and treated as such. They were bad old bosses in those days. They were the boss, and you had to beg for bread. Good old Jesse Hodges. And this is an example of what the 14-year-old boys used to do, because the thin seams, they had to drag the coal out using hods to the main runways. And it was under appalling conditions, really. I mean, I have to add about this sculpture, which is in the Sudeley Valley. Very, very sadly, it was vandalized and completely destroyed just over a week ago. And I don't know how anyone could do that to such a fantastic sculpture, which means so much for people in the Forest of Dean. I don't know whether the people were ever going to get caught who did it, but it was an absolutely disgusting, despicable thing to have done. This is Albert Meek talking about Hodding when he was a young lad. You'd cry all day and you'd cry all night. You'd get sore shoulders, you would get sore knees, and you would say to your parents, "What would you do for my sore knees?" Put them in the jerry. They used to use urine on the sores. This is Bill James from Cinderford demonstrating Hodding. You can see what it's like there. Right, the next section, we're just going to look at the roots. It's impossible to understand what happened in 1921 without going right back to World War I. The 30 years leading up to World War I witnessed an unrivaled expansion in the coal industry. In 1913, the industry produced a record output of nearly 57 million tonnes of coal. At this time, there was a workforce of about 1 million miners, including over 6,000 men from the Forest of Dean. Coal had laid the foundations for British industrial supremacy, and coal exports paid for the country's imports of cheap food. The continued prosperity of the industry and a society that was dependent upon it appeared certain. However, at the same time, miners had become more and more dissatisfied with their pay and conditions of work, while becoming more conscious of the importance of their contribution to the economy. Consequently, in the years from its formation in 1888, British miners had by 1919 built up their trade union, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, to be probably the most powerful trade union in the world, with the ability to challenge the colliery owners and their backers in government. At the time, the General Secretary was Frank Hodges, who was actually born in the Forest of Dean. He was born in Wollaston, He's the son of a farm labourer in Woodiston, and farm labourers at that time were very badly paid, and like lots of them, they moved into the coal areas to get better paid work. So the whole family actually moved up to South Wales when Hodges was a teenager. The president, probably a lot of people would know, was Robert Smiley from Scotland, and Herbert Smith, famously saying "no doing" whenever he was in negotiations, took over from Smiley in March 1921. During 1910 to 1921, the industry was characterised by bitter struggles between employers and the increasingly powerful Federation. The threat the miners posed to the established order was increased in 1913 with the formation of the Triple Alliance of Mining, Transport and Railway Unions, when they agreed to coordinate industrial disputes and support each other through solidarity action. So here we have Jimmy Thomas from the NUR, and then Robert Williams and Ernest Bevan, which I'm sure you will know, from the National Transport Workers Federation. I think there was probably 30 or 40 different separate unions in the National Transport Workers Federation. It's a very loose federation. Just to go on to look at the issue about wages. At this time, wages paid to miners varied from district to district, depending on the profitability of the pits. Wage rates were negotiated locally. In the Forest of Dean, they were about 1/3 lower than the districts where productivity was higher. So the minimum wage paid to a skilled hewer in the Forest in 1914 was 5 shillings 5 pence a shift, while in Yorkshire it was 8 shillings a shift. Yet the work conditions were much worse. At this time, during World War I, profiteering by colliery owners and inflation led to increasing industrial unrest. As a result, the government took financial control, but not ownership of the industry. And there was a complex arrangement put into place in which colliery owners were guaranteed a standard profit based on pre-war earnings, which actually were particularly high. Excess profits went into a pool to fund those companies if they failed to reach their standard profits. The remaining profits went to the Treasury. In addition, in 1917 and 1918, the Miners' Federation negotiated 2 national wage settlements based on flat rate increases above the existing district rates, referred to as a war wage. This was significant. It was the first time a wage increase had been determined nationally. World War I increased the divergence of class interests, which led to conflicting opinions among those who sought to represent the interests of miners. And the miners in the Forest of Dean were mainly organised in the Forestry Miners Association. There was also a Craftsmen's organisation, which I'll talk about later. I mean, this conflict was epitomised by debates within the Forestry Miners Association, which was a trade union representing the majority of forest miners, whose full-time agent at that time was George Rowlinson. Here he is. In December 1918, the forest miners passed a vote of no confidence in Rowlinson over his support for the Liberal Party, the conscription of miners, and his reluctance to support industrial action. In January 1918, an election for the FDMA executive led to younger, more militant leadership, led by miners like Reuben James and David Organ. Here's David Organ there in the middle. Anyone from the Forest of Dean will probably be very, very familiar with David Organ. In March 1918, Rowlinson was replaced by Herbert from Nottingham, who was a young miner influenced by syndicalism and was willing to use industrial action to achieve better working conditions for his members. There's Herbert Booth. Now, I've actually written another book where I discussed all this in a lot more detail if anyone's interested, which is called Coal on One Hand and Men on the Other. Ultimately, it was the challenge made by forest miners in their struggles with their employers, combined with a more class-conscious approach to industrial and social problems. That was a legacy of the domestic industrial experience of the war in the Forest of Dean and the emergence of a new leadership of the FDMA. During war, wages did not keep up with inflation, and this contributed to an aggressive and militant post-war mood of labour in the coalfield, which the ruling class desperately sought to control, and which laid the foundations for the confrontation of 1921. And this gives you an idea of why there was a certain degree of resentment about wages. Compared here, you can see the wages compared to owners' profits, and that actually miners' wages didn't even keep up with inflation during the war. Right, so moving on now to post-war and in the national picture. I'm sure you all know who this man is. In 1918, the day after the armistice, Lloyd George promised returning servicemen a land fit for heroes. However, in 1919, the Tory Liberal coalition government faced a developing economic and social crisis and cut back on its plans to invest in industry, housing, public works and public services. Post-World War I Britain witnessed a wave of social unrest as workers and soldiers demanded a more just way to organise society in response to aspirations raised by the war. Unrest in the armed forces, civil disorder and industrial conflict created a social and political crisis for the government. At the forefront of the movement for social and economic transformation were the coal miners, many of whom had either fought in the war itself or worked flat out in the mines to produce coal for the war effort. In January 1919, the miners demanded their industry be taken into public ownership with joint control by workmen in the state. The forest miners, along with the Miners' Federation, were keen to have a national wage agreement and believed this could be achieved through nationalisation of the industry. So in January 1919, they passed this motion, which contained this clause: it is clearly in the national interest to transfer the entire industry from private ownership and control to the state ownership, with joint control by administration and administration by the workmen and state. And here you get a sense of the influence of syndicalism and the idea of workers' control. The demands, if you read through these demands, you see pretty well all of them relate to the issue of demobilised miners. A reinstatement of demobilised miners on full pay, displaced miners to be paid an out-of-work allowance equivalent to full pay. Miners injured in the war should be provided with rehabilitation and be retained in a suitable occupation on full pay. They demanded a 30% increase in wages. Inflation was still going up. Hours to be reduced from 8 to 6 to reduce unemployment among miners returning from the war. In the Forest of Dean, the FDMA argued that there should be a 50% increase to keep up with inflation, and also emphasised the need for a national wage agreement. They went to a ballot for strike action to force the government to concede to their demands. So nationally, there was 6-1 in favour of strike action. The Forest of Dean were 26-1 in favour. So much bigger vote for the strike in the Forest of Dean than there was nationally. Frank Hodges, writing in 1925, said that in 1919, everything was in trim for the most smashing blow that had ever been delivered at the system, which had governed the coal industry since its inception. However, Lloyd George, very shrewd tactician, proposed a royal commission to look into the running of the industry. And the commission was to be made up of representatives of the Miners' Federation and colliery owners, and some independents as well. And then Hodges and Smiley threw in the hallway of their arguments and influence to get the men and delegates to accept the Royal Commission. The commission sat and it produced an interim report, which was 2 shillings per shift, flat rate increase in wages. Remember, inflation was going up all the time, and a 7-hour working day, which I mean, the government seemed to be willing to accept. But Lord Sankey said at the time, at this point, in the interim report, even upon the evidence already given, the present system of ownership working in the coal industry stands condemned, and some other system must be substituted for either nationalisation or a method of unification by national purchase and or joint control. So he's very clear there about what he's saying. Bonar Law, the Tory leader of the House, in the House, said on 20th March 1921, "I say now on behalf of the government that we're prepared to adopt the report in spirit as well as in the letter, and take all the necessary steps to carry out its recommendations without delay." So we had the final reports. The main report from Sankey recommended nationalisation. The 3 other reports, one was from the miners, which recommended joint control by workers in the state. The others, not surprisingly, recommended private ownership. And there was a 4th report, which recommended some sort of district boards run by private companies. But the main recommendation from Sankey, from the main report, was for nationalisation. Now it's just, this is Lloyd George for you. It's a slight change here from the Bonar Law quote, if you can remember that from a few quotes ago. Now, Lloyd George is saying, oh, the miners are going to be returned to private ownership in August 1921. And friends of many outside seem to assume that when a government appoints a commission, it is an honour and bound to accept all its recommendations and put them into operation. I have never heard of a doctrine in the whole history of the House of Commons. Slight change there, you notice. Vernon Hartshorn from South Wales, on the executive, obviously a bit pissed off. We have been deceived, betrayed, and duped. Obviously the miners were really, really pissed off, and there was loads of strikes. I'm going to jump quite quickly through this. I mean, there was loads of unofficial strikes now, and things were kicking off all over the place. But the leaders chose to stick to constitutional means to win nationalisation. Hodges and Smiley and others still thought that the moral argument in favour of nationalisation was so strong that just by persuasion and lobbying, etc., they could convince the government to nationalise the mines, and they set up a campaign called the Mines and Nation campaign. But across the country, there was just loads of local and unofficial strikes, and it wasn't just the strikes. It was just in the forest, just threats of strikes. Won quite a lot of concessions over issues of victimisation, sacking of workers, and they actually got quite a decent locally agreed wage rise as well. But still, miners' wages were only just about keeping up with inflation. And the railway and dockers were doing a lot better. There was a national rail strike in September, October 1919, and they won a national wage deal. Ernest Bevan negotiated a deal for the dockers in March 1920. So the other partners in the Triple Alliance were doing a bit better. In autumn 1920, there was a 16-day strike of the miners over a demand for a 2 shilling wage increase, per shift increase, and they won that. it was linked to a productivity deal linked to national output and the price of exports. But they were given a commitment to set up a national wage board by March 21. But you notice there the temporary 2 shilling wage increase was only until January 1921. And this was agreed in November 1921, so it wasn't that great. The Forest of Dean didn't support that at all. So now we're coming up close to the actual lockout itself. Severe. At the end of 1920, there were signs of a depression in the coal industry, partly resulting from repatriation coal from Germany flooded the market. As the depression grew, the government started losing money as the profits from the coal industry rapidly fell. In February, the government announced they were going to return the control of the mines to the owners on the 31st of March 1921. If you remember before, they were talking about doing it in August. The response from the owners was to allow ruthless competition to take its toll. They argued they had no alternative but to radically reduce labour costs, end the pool, return to district agreements, and allow ruthless competition to take its toll. The miners were stunned. Smiley here could be referring to the Forest of Dean when he said, "We will not, if we can avoid it, I assure you, see the wages of the miners in one district of this country being reduced down to starvation point or below starvation, while the miners in other parts of the country, more favourably situated, are receiving a fair remuneration for their labour." This is just a very brief summary of what the miners were pushing forward at this time and what the owners were offering, because the government was just forced the miners federation to start negotiating with the owners. So the miners were arguing for a national wages board with uniform wages right across the country, standardised uniform wages across the country. So a miner in the forest would be earning the same as a miner in Nottingham. Owners was just saying we're going to go back to district agreements, and the miners' demands was saying that their system should be funded out of a national pool. The owners didn't want a national pool and just wanted to return to competitive free enterprise. They're talking about a profit share agreement, but that was really complicated, so I left all that out. Right, in the Forest of Dean, this meant cutting miners' wages in half. This is what the owners. These are the rates the owners put up, and you can see. They just pinned them up on the pit heads. You can see it was pretty well, literally, wages being cut in half. Not surprisingly, the miners refused to go to work under these conditions. So this is how the lockout began. So they called a meeting. March 28, David Organ, who was president of the Forestry Miners Association, I'm of opinion that it would be well to go and have some fresh air and starve, as to bury ourselves in mine and starve there. So as a result, on the 31st of March 1921, 1 million British miners, including many war veterans, were locked out of their pits, including over 6,000 miners from the Forest of Dean. This was the worst time to go on strike. The export market for steam coal had collapsed and demand for house coal drops back in the summer, which was particularly hot. The government and colliery owners were well prepared, had stockpiled coal and passed an Emergency Power Act. just very briefly rush through the actual lockout itself. The key to the lockout was the Craftsmen, which I mentioned earlier. They were organised in a separate union, and the actual key people among the Craftsmen were the stokers and pumpers, because they were involved in the pumping of water, and which was absolutely crucial to prevent flooding. You know, their wages have been cut in half too, so they were locked out as well. 1st of April, they met at Speech House, and they pledged themselves to stand shoulder to shoulder in this crisis and demand from the powers that there will be a full justice for the mining community. We further pledge ourselves to play our part in bringing into operation the original demands of the Miners' Federation. So there's some of the craftsmen, the blacksmiths. They're at Princess Royal Colliery. Now, the flooding of the pits in the forest was key thing which should characterise the lockout in the Forest of Dean. 50 million gallons of water had to be dealt with daily over the forest coalfield. It's normally carried out by the craftsmen. So overmen, staff, volunteers, university students, friends and relatives were recruited to help stoke the boilers which supplied steam to the pumps. So this action, they did manage to keep most of the collieries free of flooding, except Canop, which was the most modern pit in the forest. The amount of water was so much, they weren't able to prevent it, so Canop was flooded. So we have Lord's Bledisloe from Northwood Colliery, Daily Herald, which is a left-wing newspaper, said it suggested locally that the practice he was getting might be useful for a time when his lordship earned a living. There was some blacklegging initially, but hardly any at all in 1921. There was a problem at Princess Royal or Flour Mill Colliery, as it's called, in Bream, and there was a mass picket, and the few men that had gone in to help man the pumps came out. Friday the 18th, the NUR and the Transport Federation announced they're going to call a nationwide solidarity strike fixed for the 15th of April. We are ready for action. That's all looking quite positive. Now this is where you start getting these threats from Henry Crawshay, in particular company who run the Lightmoor to Farnborough, Fox's Bridge, Hoe Beach and Eastern United Collieries. They're threatening to close the mines down. And this is obviously quite a serious threat, saying that we should call a meeting of the shareholders at the earliest possible moment and advise the abandonment of these collieries and realisation of the assets. So it's getting pretty nasty. Booth and Allen, Jack Allen was the leader of the Craftsmen. Herbert Booth, you remember from the miners. They were keen to get some students down from the Royal College School of Mines help with the pumping, but the mass meeting of ordinary rank and file miners and craftsmen made a decision that no extra help would be allowed. And as far as I know, this is Forest Dean was the only district where the miners have successfully prevented the safety men going into all the main pits. There are some pits in South Wales, but not right across the coalfield. Building up to the solidarity strikes from the Triple Alliance, Black Friday, which I expect quite a few people might know about. It's quite a complicated story, but on the 15th of April, the NUR, National Federation leaders, decided to withdraw their support, claiming frustration at the obstinacy of the Federation in refusing to consider arbitration or a temporary settlement. 3 p.m, Jimmy Thomas went outside to announce to the pressmen, it was all over boys, famous saying. Interestingly, Rupert and James was told by Lydney NUR that they were informed the strike was over at 11 a.m. So they basically had already made their minds up. huge rally at Speech House. Miners walked from all over the forest on Monday the 18th, led by brass bands. Many women were starting to get involved now. Herbert Booth said, if it so happened that the miners went down, then it surely followed that the railwaymen would go down too. He regarded it as certain that the Triple Alliance was dead as a doornail. So now the miners were dependent on the support of their local community. They did get strike pay of 10 shillings a week for the first 3 weeks, but the money had run out. So there was all the whole community got behind the miners because it was a mining community, and if the miners went down, the whole community goes down too. 80% of working men in Cinderford worked in the mines. Another option was poaching, very common among miners in the forest. To get a bit of, they were lucky in a way, they had the woods to go out poaching. This is an example. On 19th of April, 40 miners with dogs and ferrets raided a rabbit warren at Haglow Park, belonged to local JB and Tory County Councillor Edward Clissold. Again, this is reference to World War I. If old Clissold isn't satisfied with this, he'll have to lose more. We went out and fought for such as he. The rabbits are ours as much as his. Workhouse, some people tried getting money from the workhouse. Single men had no entitlement to leave outside the workhouse. So if the single men turning up wouldn't get any relief, they'd just be put in the workhouse. One of the guardians said, one of the posh ones, even he said, if this is a land for heroes to live in, are we going to put men in the workhouse after they went out and fought for us? Again, reference to World War I. There was quite a bit of outcropping when it's classic thing in miners' strikes, digging up coal from the outcrop where it reaches the surface. Quite normal during miners' strikes. But in some cases, it's operating on a commercial scale. And again, this is where a lot of women got involved. They went out and stopped it. If they saw anything going on a commercial scale, they'd go out and stop it. Edward Reynolds, NUR, speaking, said 98% of the Forest of Dean railwaymen were ready to come out and aid the miners. As a local engine driver, he should now refuse to take his engine into the colliery yard. Cooperative societies, there were 3 main cooperative societies in the forest, basically owned by the foresters themselves, and 128 traders agreed to issue coupons, weekly coupons of about 7 shillings per man. So that now you get a sense that the whole community is actually invested in a positive outcome to the lockout. An example of that, Francis Yeatman, who was a tailor in Lydney, he said, this fight was one waged on behalf of the whole industrial working class. If the collars went down, they would go down too. Labour Party, thankfully, Labour Party in them days actually supported the miners. They pledged themselves to do everything in their power to assist the miners in their struggle, call upon the miners to stand until victory is won. And more threats now. They've actually conferred on the power of the board of directors to take steps to wind up their companies. So the stakes are getting higher and higher now. This is real serious threats. There they are, just after that meeting in Gloucester. These are the directors, the Crawshay directors. This is a very famous photograph which I used for the cover of the book when the miners actually levelled a playing field in Pillowell to be used as a recreation sports ground. It's still there. It gets dug up by the boar regularly, unfortunately, but it's still there. Still a lot of solidarity from railway workers. You remember there was a railway bridge that went over from from the forest to Sharpness. It actually it's destroyed in about 1960, when some boats went into it. So there was a very strong link between Sharpness and the forest miners. And you can see here that when they tried to refuse to move some coal, they were suspended. And that was a problem that was happening right across the country. A lot of railway workers were getting suspended when they were refusing to move coal. Now this is when it starts getting even more nasty. Lots of threats being made. The Crawshays were approaching individual craftsmen, trying to persuade them to get back to work. And this is one of the letters that was sent to Jack Allen, the craftsmen's leader. Watch carefully, a certain colliery owner and colliery manager are going to make overtures to get some of your members to return to work. Destroy this letter. And more, even more threats here. They said they had men from Bristol were employed to help run the pumps, and the owners were now warning them that they would be kept on, and the craftsmen wouldn't get their jobs back. Right at the end now, getting close to the end, there was another ballot in the forest. You can see that the percentage still staying out in the forest was 89%, but nationally now it dropped back to 70%. So this is the end, really. The Miners' Federation instructed its members to return to work. The forest men argued they should stay out to the bitter end, but only found support in the smaller coalfields like Bristol, Kent, Lancashire and Somerset. They had to return to district agreements, a wage reduction, which left them far worse off than they were in 1914. And the forest men made a dignified return to work on Monday, the 3rd of July, proud that they remained solid to the end. And you can see here the wage rates from January 1921. That was at the top when they got that productivity deal and the 2 shillings. But then it dropped back to March 1921 to 15 shillings. They got a subsidy. Which sort of tailed it down, but by November 1921, they were down to, well, you can see from there, can't you? 18 shillings in January and 7 shillings in November. That's quite a drop, isn't it? And that's a graph of the cost of living. This is for the Forest of Dean. Cost of living against wages. You can see the peak there in January 1921, and you can see the issue around inflation and how it, how the wages compared to inflation. So you can see they were far worse off by the end of 1921 than they were in 1914. I'll just end it. I'll end it there, actually, I think, because it gives us time for questions.
Thank you, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating, Ian. Thank you very much, and very much a story of the West Country. Ian, you said there were 6,000 miners in the area, and 80% of all the employees in Cinderford were miners. Have we got any idea about how many other people were reliant on that mining force? I mean, we're talking about how many more thousand? Normally 3 times 18,000, 20,000 people were reliant on the mining industry in this area?
Yeah, because everything was related to mining, or there's a massive network of railways. Timber. Most of the timber was used in the pits for pit props. So I mean, brick making, they were using bricks in the pits. Stone was used in the pits. So it was kind of mining just drew the whole. So if mining went, they lost the mines at that time, the whole place would have been devastated. You know, people have left, property prices would have just plummeted. You know, it would have just been derelict. Yeah, so that was why, because they were very fearful that, you know, that the intention of the government was to shut the mines down, and employers, you know, and you can see they were actually making threats to do that anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think then that they misjudged the strength in their community rather than thinking about the mood of the wider country? There was such a very strong support for them in this area, wasn't there? And there wasn't necessarily that same strong support across the rest of the country for the miners' cause, particularly after Black Friday.
Yeah, well, I mean, the key thing which I was trying to point out was that the miners in the smaller districts and where the productivity was low were really desperate for a national agreement, because they were just getting paid so much less than Nottingham or Yorkshire or whatever. You know, I mean, sometimes people in Nottingham, Yorkshire were getting twice as what they were getting in the forest.
And do you think that's what made the Forest of Dean miners more militant than other areas? This perceived sense of injustice?
I think, well, in this particular case, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I mean, this was, I think for this, I think 1921 was the major battle for the forest. I mean, they were very, I think 1926 was different. I think they were still quite demoralized after that. But yeah, I think they really felt this was it. They really had to make a stand, you know, in 1921, and sadly it failed.
But they came back in 1926.
Yeah, of course they did. Yeah. Well, they're very similar. I mean, the problem was not. March 19 was the worst time to go on strike. You know, there was depression in the coal industry. Some of the pits were already working part-time. I mean, the government had been waiting for this since 1919. If they'd gone on strike in 1919, they would have won. The government were just waiting. And as soon as the recession comes along, you know, they stockpiled coals. They got the Emergency Power Acts in. You know, it was beginning of the summer. Steam coal, there was the export market for steam coal had dropped. You know, it was the worst possible time to go on strike, but they were pushed into it. And in that situation, you either fight or you just say, "Oh, I give up." But they were pushed into it by the government, you know, and the government were very clever. They knew exactly what they were doing. Lloyd George was such a clever politician, and he had Churchill behind him as well. You know, they knew exactly what they were doing. It's exactly the same in 1926, and the same in early 80s. It's the same story. You know, the problem is choosing when to go on strike rather than let the government or the employers choose it for you. They should have gone on strike.
Asking when did.
Sorry.
Dave Robertson's asking, when did the coalfield close? I believe the last Somerset pit closed in 1973. He was a Yorkshire miner. So when did the Forest of Dean pit start to close? In the 1930s?
Northern Night is 66, I think. It's the last pit shut in 1966.
The last pit shut in the Forest of Dean 66. Yeah. Why do you think they were so militant about letting the safety men in? Because normally in miner strikes, they're very keen to have the safety men in so that the mines can stay open.
I mean, a lot of people say forest people, and I'm sure there's a few foresters in the audience there, are very stubborn, and they thought, well, if they didn't let the safety men in, they could win the strike quicker. I mean, obviously that put a lot of pressure on the owners, keeping the pumps going. They were using university students and volunteers to keep the pumps going. I mean, that was their one leverage, because the fact that they weren't producing coal was irrelevant. They couldn't sell the coal anyway. But stopping the pits flooding was that provided a lot of leverage. You know, it provided the miners, you know, what the mine owners actually wanted to keep the pits. there was a lot of pressure keeping those pumps going and keeping the boilers going with just volunteers. So they realised that they hoped they could win it quick. That that was the only thing they had to apply pressure.
Yeah. Robin Jones wants to know, I don't know if you can answer this, was the geology in the forest similar to South Wales, i.e. difficult conditions to extract coal and split miners in the 70s with the dreaded bonus scheme? So there's two parts to this. Do we know if the geology in the forest was similar to South Wales?
Geology.
Yeah.
Oh, you'd probably have to ask a mining expert that, really. Yeah, I think there was. I think the South Wales coalfield was very different right across the coalfield anyway. You say geology? Is that am I got the right?
Yeah. You got it right in. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the forest had its own particular geology. It's like a kind of saucer, where the outcrops coming up to the surface. So yeah, it was unique geology. Yeah.
Yeah. So the faults in the coal seams made it difficult to extract because they're close, narrow seams.
Yeah. They were. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that it's possible to blame the Triple Alliance for the way in which the miners reacted in the Forest of Dean? Is it possible to blame the other unions, or is this entirely a matter for the miners in the forest?
I don't think the Triple Alliance was very problematic. The Transport Federation itself was made up of dozens of different unions. In theory, under their own rules, all those individual unions should be individually balloted before they went on strike. They did override that by calling them out, but it was always going to be problematic, I think, really. And also, I think with railway workers, I mean, they would come out in mining areas, but non-mining areas, I think probably it was problematic. And I mean, Jimmy Thomas said it's all about trying to picket a mine, but trying to picket a railway is quite difficult. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be right to blame the Triple Alliance. It was always it was a very problematic, loose organisation which never really kind of got to grips with what a full scale. Because it would effectively be a general strike in how they would organise that. They hadn't really planned it at all.
There was a great quote, wasn't there? It's easier for 300 miners to shut down one pithead than it is to try and protect 15 miles of railway sidings, which is true in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Andy Dillington says, "Thank you for a superb talk. Could you please explain the relationship between the FDMA and the MFGB? And also, I'm wondering how the forest miners' wages compared with the average wages for workers at this time."
Right, the Miners' Federation was a federation. I mean, it was. It always wanted to. There was always a lot of pressure to become like a proper industrial union, which it eventually became with the NUM. One of the problems was it was a federation. Every district had its own rules and regulations, which meant, solidarity action right across the British coalfield at that time was difficult, particularly when you had Nottingham with a kind of right-wing union who could argue that they could do better local deals than the foresters could do in their own particular conditions in the forest with low productivity. So yeah, it was a problem. It's actually John Williams who took over from Herbert Booth, who really raised the idea that they wanted the federation to become a proper industrial union, and which it eventually did with the formation of the National Union of Miners.
Nigel Crossley wants to ask a question. Can we ask him in?
Yeah.
Nigel Crossley wants to ask a question. Here's Nigel.
I was just going on from your questions, Les, really about the miners and their. In my view, what made them so strong and such a powerful sense of solidarity in mining communities, to what extent it also then prevented them from getting a better sense of how other unions were seeing the situation. I mean, it's no accident in my view that what was experienced in 1921 was almost then repeated in 1926 and was repeated again in 1984, 85, where you had these long, bitter strikes with tremendous solidarity by the miners, but an inability to compromise, if for want of a better expression, for right or wrong, that was perceived as obstinacy in 1921 and in 1926 and again in 1984, 85. Is there something in the character of mining, and that sense of solidarity also makes them not cited to the mood of the rest of the country?
I mean, possibly. I mean, miners, even in the forest, were earning more money than agricultural labourers, for instance. I mean, that was why there was a big drift from mining from rural areas into the mines. And I think they did reach out. I mean, there was in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, there was a massive solidarity rally in Lydney. Which when the local Triple Alliance committee was set up. It was a small community. They linked they were very, very close to the railway workers and the dockers and the tin plate workers. They all lived in, those are the, some of the main industries in the forest. I mean, they all lived in the same communities. They lived next door to each other. Not sure about that really, that they're kind of like blinkered or, cut off from, where the workers were. I don't think so. They weren't in the forest particularly anyway. I mean, I didn't have time to show. There's fantastic motions put through the NUR branches in solidarity with the miners. And when the railway workers went on strike in 1919, similarly, the miners refused. They absolutely supported the railway workers. So yeah, I mean, the solidarity was there locally.
I've got a follow-up for you from James Parker, who says, thanks for a great talk, Ian. I wonder if there's much impact from the 1921 lockout on the Forest of Dean Labour Party. I think the MP, James Wignall, was a member of the Dockers Union, so I wonder if there are any political tensions caused locally due to this.
Well, James Wignall he supported the miners. He stood up in Parliament and made speeches, but I mean, they didn't really. I mean, Labour MPs were still very much a minority. Then, I mean, they couldn't really wield any influence. I mean, that was a problem with trying to go down the constitutional road. That somehow, you have to wait till you get a big Labour Party before you can get nationalisation, which is probably what happened in the end. But in 1921, they wanted it now. So there was no point thinking about Parliament or Labour MPs. I mean, I mean, Wignall didn't. I only found one reference to him through the whole strike in the newspapers. He was dealing with the Labour Party. I mean, the rank and file Labour Party people, particularly the women in Pillowell, in Yorkley, in Coalford, were very much working with the miners and were out on picket lines and etc. Wignall was very much in the background. He was a kind of moderate, really. He was very popular MP, but he was a moderate.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. I don't know if you looked at the chat. There's people all over the place saying how much they've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it tremendously. It's really nice to have this sort of industrial history in the West Country. Certainly, the miners in Cornwall don't seem to have had the same sort of solidarity as they had in the Forest of Dean, and Cornwall's where I'm speaking from now, so I can say that with some personal knowledge. I don't know if we've got a graphic about the next talk, which is on Tuesday, 11th of May. It's in the chat. You might be able to see it there. Tuesday, the 11th of May, Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. We're pleased to be joined by the Professor of History, Peter Cole, from the Western Illinois University, who will tell the story of Ben Fletcher, one of the most important African-American trade unionists and wobblies. And I've been assured that's going to be a great talk. And I'm really looking forward to that one as well. Ian, it leaves me to thank you again for a great evening. I know you were nervous at the start. It didn't come over that you were nervous at all. What it came over was to
drinking my wine.
yeah, extremely. Yes, I'm going to go and have a glass. Extremely interesting, Ian. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone who's attended tonight, and hopefully we'll see you again in May. Good night. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian.
Cheers, Bye.